This is a platform where we have been inviting distinguished scholars to share their insights from diverse disciplines for our very interdisciplinary audience in order to generate an intellectually stimulating dialogue. So, therefore, I'm really delighted to welcome to our forum today Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, whose expertise on the geopolitics of Asia is truly unparalleled. Through his books, writings, and talks, firstly, Ambassador Menon has been enlightening us on what geopolitics really means because it tends to be a word which we use rather imprecisely at times. His latest book is titled India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present. This book was published by Brookings Press USA and by Penguin Random House in India in April 2021. It's a masterful analysis of how geography, history, economics, demography have all influenced India's policies and strategies since independence. Ambassador Menon's depth and breadth of knowledge in all of these fields and his ability to analyze how all of them have come to bear on India's political standing is truly remarkable and really enlightening to read. Ambassador Menon's previous book, 2016, titled Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy, similarly offered an astute reading of India's current situation as an outcome of 5 pivotal political choices in recent history. In that book, he discussed how India's response to 26/11 terrorist attacks, how India responded to Sri Lanka's brutal civil war, its nuclear deal with the United States, the border agreement with China, and its no first nuclear use policy have been very instrumental in where India stands now. He has had a long and illustrious career in diplomacy. He was the Indian ambassador. His scholarship in some ways is informed by this career, where probably he shaped some of the contemporary history, which he so astutely analyzes in all of his books. He was the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India between 2010 and 2014. He was the Foreign Secretary of India between 2006 and 2009. He has served as the Indian Ambassador or High Commissioner to China, to Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. And in each of his postings, he has been involved in some watershed foreign policy moments. He was responsible for he was at the helm of restoring High Commissioner level foreign relations between India and Pakistan after a gap of 1.5 years. Also restoring relations with China post India's nuclear weapons test of 98, facilitating free trade agreements with Sri Lanka, and also facilitating defense and intelligence relations with Israel, which continue to this day. So it's no wonder that in 2010, the Foreign Policy magazine named him as one of the top 100 global thinkers. He's currently a visiting professor at Ashoka University, India, and chair of the Ashoka Centre for China Studies. He has previously been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, and Richard Willem Fellow at MIT in 2016. And after this rather truncated introduction of Ambassador Menon's long career, I would like to invite Professor Pankaj Chandra, Vice Chancellor, Ahmedabad University, and Chairman of the Board of Management, to please say a few words.
Thank you, Suchismita. Welcome, Ambassador Menon, to Ahmedabad University. So very kind of you to take time to come and talk to us, to this very young and unusually thoughtful institution that is working towards reimagining learning. And for all of us, we're all living in very challenging and of course interesting times, and with disruptions coming from many domains, whether it's the Anthropocene or technology or the inequalities or changes in power balance around the world. And more recently, the pandemic, very honestly telling us that how the world has just grown apart so dramatically, and who better to help it sift the critical from the unimportant than you. So thank you for taking this time to share your thoughts with us who are sitting far away from the lights of Delhi and would be very keen to look forward. I wish we could have invited you here in person, but we would very much like to do that in times to come, and I hope you will accept our invitation. So welcome once again, Ambassador Menon.
Thank you so much. Hope not a third introduction. This is Patrick French. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. I'm also Professor for the Public Understanding of the Humanities. Just to say by way of welcome to Ambassador Shivshankar Menon and to those who've joined us from outside the university. I think we have about a dozen people here who are not professors or students. Just to say really that we very much welcome you also to this talk. And I think the important thing at an event like this really is that everybody gets the opportunity to hear somebody who, as Suchishmita says, is a practitioner, is also a theorist, and is also, I should say, a very, very good explainer. I think that Shivshankar Menon, like many people at the forefront of their profession, are also, very good at publicly communicating what it is that they do. So really, that's just the welcome from me. Back to Suchishmita, and let's continue with this evening's event.
I would, without further ado, give the floor to Ambassador Menon, and we'll moderate the Q&A after he's done with his talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Pankaj Chandra, Patrick French, Professor Das, for that really flattering introduction. I mean, after all this, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to live up to the advanced billing, but anyway, but thank you for that. And thank you for asking me to speak to you on geopolitics and Indian strategy. What I hope to do in the next 40 minutes or so is to consider the question of how far the Republic of India's external strategy or strategic choices were determined by geopolitical factors. I mean, to do that, I thought I'd very briefly look at our history since 47, our history of external involvement since 47, and then look at what we might do in today's situation, of how I see the situation, and see if we can then answer the question of, did geopolitics actually affect the way our strategic choices? But what I'm really looking forward to actually is to hearing what you say and to answering your questions, to the question and answer session thereafter. But what does geopolitics mean? Professor Das mentioned this. It's a really slippery term, actually. It's been used for also, has it been used and abused to the point where it actually has become meaningless? Like strategic, for instance, is used for everything, including marketing campaigns and so on. Strictly speaking, geopolitics means only the influence of geographical factors on the behavior of states or international relations. I mean, that's the sense in which the fathers of the discipline, Mackinder, Mahan, used the term in the late 19th, early 20th century. Mackinder to stress the importance of the Eurasian world island, and Mahan of control of the oceans and the rimland. And they used geopolitics basically to refer to the competition for dominion of the world from a single center of power. That's how it was elaborated from the 1870s to the 1940s in Germany, in Great Britain, in the US. And its sort of unsavory associations came from the Nazis' use of the term, of geopolitical terms like Lebensraum or living space, to justify expansion, racism, domination. Incidentally, the term Indo-Pacific was invented by Haushofer, whom Life magazine unjustly called the geopolitical guru of the Nazis. But now geopolitics is used not for some coherent doctrine, but for, in a much broader sense. I mean, if you look at the dictionary today, it says it's the study of the influence of such factors as geography, economics, and demography on the politics, and especially the foreign policy of a state, which is the larger sense of the term, in which I will use it, as the sort of long-term drivers of state behavior. But it's hard to forget that, you know, the whole discipline arose in a particular European context, and it still reflects that. European, later Atlantic. At its core, it was a reflection on the nature of structuring of power in an integrating world. That's what actually makes it relevant to us today. By the late 19th century, the world had been carved up between European empires. It had become a closed system, as Mackinder noted. And those imperial centers then turned on each other with elimination rounds leading up to 2 world wars, and where finally geopolitical visions took over from imperial ones. But anyway, that's a whole different background, but I'll use it in the more standard, broader definition that we have today. So how far have India's foreign and security choices been determined by geopolitical factors? When we look back at independent India's foreign and security policies, they occur and they have to cope with 3 sort of periods, 3 broadly speaking periods of the external situation, which changed dramatically. One, of course, was the Cold War, the post-World War II bipolar world, which emerged with 2 superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. And that was the first. The second was really a unipolar moment with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s in 1991, and where there was one single superpower, the US. But these were also the globalization decades, when the neoliberal project was at its height and the world economy was globalized through the 80s, 90s, noughts, until the global financial crisis in 2008. After which, I think there's considerable debate on how to call this period after the unipolar moment. I myself think it's a world between orders. It's a world adrift, as it were, but we'll come to that. So India was born, or the Republic of India was born into a very new geopolitical situation of a bipolar world divided between 2 superpowers. Not that they were ever equal. In fact, the US was superior in most respects of power. The Soviet Union depended on 2 things, actually. One was military power, where she could match the US. And the other was ideological appeal. I mean, it is quite remarkable. I think we underestimate it, partly because history is written by the victors. We underestimate the ideological appeal that socialism, communism had across the world, especially in Asia, in our home. Because Asia, when India became independent, was still largely colonized, with the exception of, you know, the Thailand, Philippines. Japan was under occupation. China was fighting a civil war, but the rest of Asia was still, and the old imperial powers tried to come back in. But for India itself, independence actually posed a whole new set of problems, because the India at that stage, I mean, we had a life expectancy of around 26 years. We had about 14% literacy, 8% among women. There was hunger, disease, starvation. I mean, we've just gone through the huge Bengal famine, a man-made famine created by the British imperial structures. So this was an India which was poor, weak, and it was an India which was being born into a very different world. And it was not the successor to the Raj. I mean, there are many people who look backwards and say, why didn't India do this? Why didn't India do that? The Raj had done this. For 3 fundamental reasons. Partition, which created a Pakistan which was hostile to India from day one. Because don't forget, Pakistan got independence from India. We might have got independence from the British, but Pakistan got independence from India. And by being hostile, Pakistan also cut India off, at least in terms of physical access, from Central and West Asia. Secondly, China took Tibet, occupied Tibet in 1950. And for the first time in history, we had Chinese troops on our border. Before that, we had a boundary with Tibet. We had a boundary which was respected by both sides thanks to custom, treaty, various sorts of arrangements over time. But the People's Republic of China, once it came into Tibet, thought that what it hadn't agreed to was not agreed, and we therefore ended up with the world's biggest boundary dispute with China. But China's presence in Tibet also changed. And thirdly, the Royal Navy was withdrawn. Under the Raj, the British government in India took care of the land frontiers and security on land. But maritime security was an imperial function because British power depended on it, was controlled out of London. So in a sense, the Raj and the successor government started life sea blind, and it took some decades for that to be overcome. But the withdrawal of that actually changed why do I say the withdrawal of the Royal Navy mattered? Not because there was a threat from the sea to India immediately, no, but because the sea has always historically been our connection with the rest of the world for the last 3,000 years, if you look back at our history. Unfortunately, we have been taught and are taught a sort of Delhi-centric, Indo-Gangetic Valley version of Indian history. Whereas if you actually look at it, the most prosperous, the most advanced parts of India have been those parts which have been connected with the rest of the world. And that's actually maritime South Asia, all the way from the Gujarat coast down to Malabar, to the Coromandel coast, and Vanga in the larger sense, from all the way along. And these are the parts which in 1750 accounted for most of our industrial production. These were the core cultural and civilizational areas. These were the most prosperous parts because India has always been most prosperous and has done best when most connected to the world and most engaged with the world. And most of that engagement was actually by sea. Yes, by land as well, under the Mauryas and for brief periods, but not for as long as for the sea. So independent India could not choose a strategy of coping with this world, which was identical to what the Raj had done. It had to think in a completely new situation, this bipolar situation, which, by the way, historically has always been a very unstable situation. I mean, this Cold War was the only one which ended without the two main superpowers ending up in a war because one of them collapsed. But all other bipolar systems in history, the Liao and the Song, you go back to, they ended up in wars. But be that as it may, facing this kind of world, and given the condition in which India was in, we made a really brave choice to be non-aligned, not to join one side or the other. It would have been much easier to join one side or the other. But then our fate and our decisions would have been dependent on what the alliance or the superpower wanted, what their interests were. And we didn't see their interests as being identical to ours. So it was really a brave strategic choice to say we'll work with both sides. We will decide on individual issues on the basis of their merits and how they affect our interests. Because it was clear that our job in life was to transform India, to make India into a modern, prosperous, secure state, a strong, powerful country where every Indian could achieve their potential, or at least had the opportunity of achieving their potential. And if that was the goal, transforming India, and which frankly is a goal accepted across the political spectrum, we might differ on the final kind of India that we want at the end of it. And today, maybe we are renegotiating that social contract among ourselves. But the basic function of foreign policy then becomes very simple: to enable the transformation of India. And when able, when you have the capacity, to create external conditions which help that transformation. And non-alignment actually was therefore a logical choice. It was a brave response to an external situation, but it also came from an ideological basis which I think is best expressed in Nehru's Discovery of India. There's a whole section actually where he says what's wrong with geopolitics, because he thinks geopolitics was responsible for the world wars, and that power politics is now impossible and dangerous because of the presence of nuclear weapons, because now for the first time we can annihilate ourselves, and because the world has changed fundamentally. And that in order to transform India, we need peace. We need an area of peace. We can't get involved. So the strategic choices really were to some extent determined by the geopolitics, but not entirely. I mean, if you see non-alignment as a creative strategic choice, you have to, and don't forget the non-alignment left considerable room for balancing behavior, for other sorts of behavior. Non-alignment was not neutrality. It didn't mean that 50-50, that or that a pox on both your houses, that you stay away from everybody. What non-alignment meant was the freedom to make decisions on the basis of your own interests. So when the international balance shifted, for instance, in 1971, in the midst of the East Pakistan, later Bangladesh crisis, when the US, Nixon and Kissinger opened up to China, and both China and the US were opposed to what was happening, what India was trying to achieve in Bangladesh. India then balanced that by entering into the Indo-Soviet Treaty, a treaty which had been ready, negotiated, kept, but for 2 years, Mrs. Indira Gandhi had not signed until she saw the need to do so in order to ensure external neutrality and the space, the diplomatic space within which Bangladesh's birth could then be midwifed. So I think there is therefore considerable play in non-alignment. I mean, it's not that non-alignment is an abdication of choice. It's not neutrality, and it doesn't draw its roots from, say, what was done with Austria in the 50s or Swiss or Belgian neutrality. Not at all. But once the world shifted and we ended up in a unipolar moment, India adjusted again. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was only one superpower, the US, and she was head and shoulders above anyone else. There was no question that, and this was a very different world. This was a world where economic power had shifted, where the world was being rapidly globalized and tied together, both by technology and by the creation of global value chains. And by trade, basically. So, and you saw the reaction, 3 prime ministers from very different backgrounds with different ideas, different ideologies, Narasimha Rao, Vajpayee, and Manmohan Singh, all followed a very similar set of policies adjusting to the post-Cold War world, where the US was the only superpower and the global economy saw the high tide of globalization with all its benefits and drawbacks. What they did was to actually open the Indian economy, integrate us into the rest of the world. When we started reform in 1991, only about 15.3% of India's GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, that had gone up to 49.6%. That's just merchandise trade, almost half our GDP. Of course, it's dropped since then. World trade has shrunk since then, but and now we're somewhere in the low 30s. But if you add services, you add remittances, the external sector at one stage accounted for more than half our GDP, and that's a very high degree of integration. China was even more integrated. In fact, it went up into the 70s, 70% for China at one stage. But what they chose then was all 3 of these prime ministers, and for that period was an omnidirectional policy of improving relations across the board, whether it was setting up an embassy in Israel, which we had actually recognized in the late 40s, setting up an office in Taiwan and doing the normal business that countries do without affecting the One China policy, improving relations with China, because both India and China at that stage were concentrating on transforming their relationship with the US. For the Chinese, after Tiananmen, and with the US now having, they thought, achieved regime change and the collapse of communism in East Europe and the Soviet Union, they thought they would be the next target. So the last thing they wanted was other trouble. So we signed a boundary status quo agreement, which committed both to maintaining the status quo, and that basically kept the peace for the next 2 decades, a little more than 2 decades. And given that, and each of us concentrated, I mean, at least from India, we tried very hard then to work much more closely with our own neighborhood, integrate the neighborhood while we were integrating into the world, and making foreign and security policy much more economics driven than ever before. But the unipolar moment only lasted until the global financial crisis of 2008, which was taken by China and many others as marking the terminal decline of the West. This may have been partly true of Europe, but it certainly wasn't true of the US. But since then, we are actually today in a world that I would say is between orders. Some people say it's multipolar, not yet. And it's not bipolar either. It's not China and the US. They are streets ahead of everybody else. China is a global economic power, there's no question. You look at any of the indicators. But in military terms, she is a local regional power. The US is still the only power which can project military power across the globe wherever she wants, whenever she wants. But we are now in a world which, and I say it's between orders, which is because it's the product of globalization, it's a product of technology, but it's also a world of paradox. More people live longer, better, healthier, more prosperous lives than ever before in history. There's no question. Yet, if you look at inequality, conflict, uncertainty, they're all at levels unseen since World War II. Deaths by conflict and displaced people, refugees, internally and externally, are at levels which we last saw at the end of World War II when the Chinese Civil War was still going on. So globalization made the world into one system, into one economic and geopolitical system. But also at the same time, by making it one system, expanded the risks and contagion. I mean, we saw that during the pandemic. What happens when a pandemic spreads across a globalized world? For me, as I said, this is a world between orders. The world economy is multipolar with the rise of China, but the political order, which saw us through first the Cold War, then the unipolar moment, that no longer exists. Whether it's a multilateral system, you saw the pathetic international response to the COVID pandemic. I mean, all this alphabet, what did the UNSC, G20, all these meetings, G7, what did they do for COVID? I mean, basically, it was each country looking out for itself. The other thing that globalization did, of course, was to bring the world's economic and political center of gravity back to Asia, where it was historically before 1850, but to a very different and new Asia. In 1980, I mean, this is clearest from, I think, the shift in global GDP. In 1980, the advanced countries, OECD countries, accounted for 64% of world GDP. And but by 2016, this was down to 42%, less than half. The biggest drop actually was for Europe, from 30% in 1980 down to about 16% in 2016. US stayed where it was, between 25 and 28%. I mean, it just fluctuates in that range. China was the biggest gainer, from 2.3% all the way up to 17.8%, while India increased her share of global GDP from a little less than 3% to about 7.24%. And between 2000 and 2011, India and China pulled 232 million people out of poverty, with India accounting for 170 million. COVID, by some accounts, has halved those gains in India. China is not telling. Although Premier Li Keqiang said in 2019 that over 600 million Chinese live on less than renminbi 1,000, which is about $155 each month. And hence the shift in Chinese policy over the last 2 years towards what they now call common prosperity, which includes reducing inequality, increasing the role of the state, antitrust and other measures against some of the biggest private firms, including technology firms. By 2014, India and China together, by 2016, India and China together had a similar share of world GDP as the US did. And since then, China has continued to grow. But where it really makes a difference is by 2019, for instance, China was accounting for something like 40% of the growth in the world economy. So the dynamism in the world economy is actually coming out of Asia. And India and China together account for about half of Asia's total GDP. If you look in PPP terms, of course, they're the world's largest, third largest economies. In nominal terms, second and fifth. So we're in a new globalized world with unintended consequence. The balance of power has shifted with the rise of China and with others like India, Korea, etc., others rising. And the established powers naturally feel threatened. They're pushing back. China-US contention is the result of the shift in the balance of power. But the other thing that globalization did was to threaten people's identities, because now you could see what was happening across the world in the palm of your hand, in your phone, and ideas, other things. And globalization basically became a threat to local identities. And it also led to tremendous urbanization. Today, for the first time in history, most of the world's population lives in cities, which means they were taken out of their traditional home, clan, family, village, out of their traditional support structures, exposed to this whole world. And the paradoxical result has been politics, the politics of emotion, which has led to the rise of new authoritarians, whether it was in Japan, in China, in India, across Turkey, Russia, all the way up to Trump, and who appeal to nativism, appeal to nationalism, who use personality cults to try and manage the economy. Why? Because as the world economy slows, as globalization is being fragmented into regional trading blocks, it's getting harder and harder to keep delivering. You see this most clearly in China, where originally the legitimacy of the Communist Party rule in China in the 50s, 60s was ideological. There was broad ideological support for the idea that China needed to move towards socialism, be more egalitarian, that everybody had to share in prosperity. But I think the Great Leap Forward Cultural Revolution inoculated people against that kind of mass politics and ideology. And under Deng, basically the regime relied on performance legitimacy, on the simple appeal that we will make you better off today than you were yesterday, and your children will be even better off than you are. And as long as the answer to both those questions is yes, the regime had performance legitimacy and support. But as the Chinese economy has started slowing, and inequality grew due to the pattern of growth, and this is true of most globalizing societies, increasingly you see the leadership relying on nationalism, on personality cults, on other forms of legitimacy, trying to go back to charisma and so on. You see this in China, you see it in other countries as well. And COVID has accelerated these trends, both globally and for India as well. And put governments everywhere under stress. The world economy is fragmenting. You've seen that it's becoming increasingly in North America, USMCA, there's one free trade area, there's another in Europe, and the RCP, CPTPP both compete in the Asian space. India is the only major economy, by the way, which is not part of any of these. There are no universally accepted rules of the road anymore. And there's new domains of contention, whether it's cyber security, outer maritime space. And we've seen really what I would think is almost the death of multilateralism and the failure of the post-World War II multilateral system, certainly. So why does this matter, what I say about the nature of authoritarian politics? It matters because it makes diplomacy, give and take, much more difficult. And the peaceful solution of disputes, therefore, becomes much harder. And today you see, as a consequence of the rise of China, of hypernationalism, you see a ring of flashpoints, of hotspots around China, which are now active, whether it's the East China Sea, Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands between Japan and China, Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's the India-China border. So we're entering a really dangerous phase of power politics, unmediated by institutions. Some of us, 8 of us actually, tried to look at what does this mean for India over the next decade, and we've produced a paper called India's Path to Power, Strategy in a World Adrift, which we released on the 2nd of October, which we put out in the public domain for comments, responses, suggestions, so that we can revise it after public discussion. For those who are interested, it's on the Center for Policy Research and the Takshashila Institute websites, though they are not responsible for the paper, they're just hosting it. So what should we do in this situation where the world looks much more uncertain, where it doesn't look as though there is an order which is going to take care of this? I think what we need to concentrate on self-strengthening. I mean, that is essential. But we need also some clarity of vision. We need, therefore, and you can see the effects in our neighborhood, we need to work with our neighbors much more closely because we need a peaceful periphery if we are to transform India. Our answer is strategic autonomy, along with self-strengthening, because what we do at home greatly affects what we are able to do abroad. And we need, therefore, but we also need to engage with the neighborhood. Walking away from the RCP, for instance, makes it much more difficult. You can't have an active foreign defense, security policy abroad and work with others if you are cutting them out of your economy. For the last 5 years, we have been steadily raising customs duty. And as I said, we walked away from regional integration fora. So we need to actually improve our own competitiveness and participate in the global economy. India did best when she was most open to the world economy and when she actually used her strengths abroad. We need a trade agenda. We have fundamental issues here, which we need to settle both at home and abroad, increasing our own competitiveness. And we need to engage with Asia. There are opportunities in this world. I mean, China-US contention opens up opportunities, certainly in our relationship with the US. The US is essential to our own transformation, not just as a balancer vis-a-vis China, but if we want to transform India, we need the technology, we need what we can do with the US together. And we need to learn from history. Every successful rising power in history, and there have been less successful ones than unsuccessful ones, did three things. They built their material power. They also built a narrative of success, not of victimhood. And they followed an accommodationist strategy. They played by the existing rules until they had sufficient power to change them. And that's a very fine judgment. Many powers, Japan in the 30s, Germany twice, got it wrong. They moved too early and they failed and actually suffered devastation as a result. Ambition, once it's revealed, cannot be taken back or hidden. Others, established powers, rivals, other rising powers, will act to squash it because they will respond to what they see. So for me, the answer ultimately, is talk less and do more. And so I began by asking, is India's external strategy determined by geopolitics? My answer is only to a certain extent. India did adjust to the changing international situation we've seen. That's unavoidable. But geopolitics doesn't explain India's fundamental choices of non-alignment, of strategic autonomy, of integrating with the world economy after 91, of becoming a nuclear weapon state, and so on. If it did, India's policies would be entirely reactive to the situation. Instead, they were creative, proactive, eschewing easy choices like alignment in the 50s when we lacked agency in the international system. And it seems to me the real driver behind India's external strategic choices until recently was the overwhelming need to transform India and to create an enabling environment for it. And this was irrespective of the party in power or the ideology. Whether this is still true will only be clear from the outcomes that present policies produce. And I'd be very happy to discuss any of this or anything else that interests you in India's foreign and security policies in the question and answer. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon, for this very wonderful, insightful and expansive talk in such a short time. And you have left us lots of time for questions. So we can open it up to the audience. So if you can raise your hand and just let's begin with that. Let's begin with direct questions, and then we can use the chat room if we have a clutter of questions. Okay, so let's start with Supratim, and then we'll go to Arham. Supratim, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, so am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so thank you for a very intriguing seminar and a lot of information, as Suchishmita said, in a very short amount of time. I am a professor of economics at Ahmedabad University. My question is, if geopolitics is tied with two things, ideology, presence, of course, like the security risk comes with it, how much strategic is India's position in a continent like Africa? Like, for example, because of business interests which compete with China in the larger economies of Africa, and of course the problem of insurgency and militancy in countries like Nigeria and Niger. Thank you very much.
Well, it seems to me that when you look at geopolitics, I said economics, history, geography, of course, but resource endowment is critical. In our case, why have we done best when we are connected to the world? Because we lack non-ferrous metals, we lack energy. I mean, you look at our imports today, 80% of our imports are maintenance imports. The fertilizer, these are things you can't do without, quite apart from your needs for capital, technology, etc., to develop the economy, right? So you have to be engaged with the world. How do you pay for all the stuff that you need? Unless you export, unless you get into a relationship with the rest of the world. And that's why you did best when you opened up and you integrated with the world. So for me, it's a strategic imperative. I mean, yes, you can always argue, do I need this particular, do I need beryllium? Do I need lithium? Do I need this? Do I need that? All that every state does, that calculus. But in our case, there is a fundamental need. We rely on the world for energy. We rely on the world for fertilizer. We can't feed ourselves without that. I mean, there are fundamental needs that we have of the world. And if we want to transform India, we can't do without the world, which is why we have always followed an active external policy. Because now this idea that somehow every time we cut ourselves off, we tried import substitution for a while.
For a very long time.
Our best years. I mean, you know.
Yes.
You know. So I'm not saying that you go into this blindly, just open everything, do the neoliberal thing. No, not at all. Follow your interests, that's why strategic autonomy. You keep the decision-making in your hands, but you must follow your interests and follow these long-term drivers, which includes for me.
Yeah, but like any comment on these countries?
Africa becomes very important.
Okay.
Because, I mean, why are the Chinese in Africa? Why are they so active? Same reason that you are. Chinese similar, except the opposite. They have non-ferrous metals. They don't have ferrous metals. But apart from that, they need their energy. India and China together are the world's biggest importers of fertilizer. We used to actually coordinate, by the way, in the 80s among ourselves. So we didn't end up going to market at the same time and driving up all the prices for both of us. But so Chinese have the same problem. We have the same problem. And frankly, Africa is strategic in that sense. That's where the importance comes. Quite apart from, choke points to the Indian Ocean, the Madagascar Straits, etc. All that is second order strategy. But if you don't have these basics, you won't even be in the game for the rest of it. That's my point.
Sure. Like, I mean, Switzerland became so famous for chocolates, but like half of the world does not know that like Switzerland does not have any chocolate actually.
Exactly.
Thank you, Shivshankar.
Yes.
So let's go to Arham now, and then we'll come to Kaushik.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So I had this question since long, and I have tried to answer it somehow, but I want to know your opinion on this. What if India had decided to align with America just after the independence? How would the situation of India right now would change if India would have aligned with America? Would it change the dynamics of India and Pakistan? Would we have we would be more friendly with the neighboring countries, say Pakistan or Afghanistan, saying if we had aligned with America at the start?
The record of client states is not good. If you just look at the numbers, what happened to most of them. The ones who actually did well are those who either fought a war against America and then got occupied and defeated, or who actually, like South Korea or Taiwan, who served a US purpose in the Cold War, right? I mean, they were meant to stop the domino effect in Asia. Taiwan because of China, and Taiwan suddenly is important again because of the rise of China. But now the problem here is, when the US after World War II, when Truman, Dean Acheson in 1950, when they described US security, they actually left Taiwan, South Korea out of it. One reason why the Korean War started, why Mao and Kim Il-sung were able to persuade Stalin to let Kim Il-sung invade the South in 1950, was because they said, look, the Americans aren't even going to defend them. They've left them out of their defense perimeter in Asia, which they took from Japan to Philippines. But the moment the North invaded, because of Cold War reasons, because it was seen as, oh, see, the Soviets are gaining, so we have to oppose them. So it became a US interest. US then went to the Security Council, Soviets weren't present, so it became a UN force, etc. But those were for US-Soviet reasons that the US did what it did in these places. But you look at the record of other alliance states, and in our case, frankly, I don't think you can make the case that there was such a US interest in helping to transform India. India might have been useful, but at that stage, you were not an attractive market. You were in no condition actually and you look like a bottomless pit, which is why, frankly, in 54, 55, for Cold War reasons, where did they go? They went to Pakistan. Pakistan joined Ashoka Centre. So I'm not even sure that the choice was available. Even today, many people say, oh, why aren't we aligned with the US? Why aren't we allies with the US? Is there an alliance on offer? The US has never said that she will fight for the defense of India. I mean, we can't assume that just because we have such bad relations with the Chinese after Spring 2020, and the US has terrible or strategic rivalry with the Chinese, therefore they'll offer you a military alliance. As far as they're concerned, you're going to do their work anyway, because you have bad relations with the Chinese. So why should they? Nobody's offered you that kind of military alliance. Today, what you're doing with the US is you are working together on all the areas where you have common interests, where you have congruence, which is a lot, whether in counterterrorism, intelligence, defense, security, maritime security, especially, I mean, the Quad and so on. You're doing a great deal with the US. I mean, you could argue that you're doing everything that an alliance would do short of a mutual commitment to defend each other. I mean, we're not going to get into a war just because the US has gotten into it, and vice versa. And I don't see any appetite on the US side to get involved in any land wars in Asia for a long time to come after Afghanistan, etc. And it's really reinforced the allergy post-Vietnam. So therefore, I'm not sure that that option was really available or would have helped you particularly. I mean, they might have signed you up in the alliances, but then what? You know, would it have helped you to transform India? You know, you have to reach a certain stage, which we actually reached because of our own efforts, when people then start actually wanting to work with you. That's the paradox of alliances, right? You don't want an ally who's needy. You want an ally who brings something to the table. But if he has something to bring to the table, why should he get into an alliance? So it's a paradox. And it's a fine balance where you really have to look at the Venn diagram of where do your interests overlap. And if there is a huge degree of overlap, as there was between NATO members, West Europe, their fear of Soviet invasion, and US hold the Soviets back, contain the Soviet Union, then you get into an alliance. In our case, I'm not even sure that it was available. But you know, this is one of the big what ifs, right? It's a very good question, but nobody can give you the final answer. I can only tell you what I think. Could be right, could be wrong.
Thank you, Ambassador. So we can take the next question from Kaushik, and then we'll come to Manan. Kaushik, you're muted.
Yeah.
Yes. Good evening, Professor Menon. We just got a nice landscape of the foreign policy and this kind of international relationship. And I don't have much reading on this part. I am a professor here at Ahmedabad University. My name is Kaushik Jana, and I have two questions. The first question is, you mentioned that we need to learn from the history to make a better decision. My question is, how much, so we can see that the international decision our government and policymakers made a kind of a success. But how much actually this kind of history or experience data nowadays actually taken care of to make decisions? And like in the era of this AI, artificial intelligence, where we can gather information even from history and then can make an objective decision, how much this kind of tools is used nowadays, or how do you see whether it is useful or not? So that's the first question. The second part is, so yeah, we understand that foreign policy, which is very country level, very high level, as a public, how I can relate to this kind of country specific aim with as a person. Like in the COVID case, we see that the cases are rising. But whenever we understand that relationship of my standing or how I am affecting by this factor, make me more attentive to the measures. So communication of this foreign policy through the policymakers to the public. What is your thought on that part? Thank you.
Oh, two huge questions, very big, very fundamental questions, very good questions actually, about the uses of history. Well, of course, there is a point beyond which, history never repeats itself. Things are never the same. You can't find complete analogies in history and so on. What you're learning from history, therefore, is larger, is you're trying to learn patterns of behavior. You're trying to see what outcomes certain behaviors resulted in, and whether or not those were helpful. What were the factors that actually created certain? So you're actually looking at the history. The trouble is that the same event can be told in many ways, right? The Rashomon effect. You can, and you draw different lessons from history. The Chinese use this narrative, which they've now really made official, of century of humiliation, in order to drive a nationalist perspective, right? And it's almost as though it justifies bad behavior today. Until 1992, under Mao Zedong, by the way, the National Library of China says that between 1950 and 1976, Mao's death, not one book on national humiliation or century of humiliation was published in China. Why? Because Mao saw it as class struggle. He saw it as a heroic story of the Chinese people having stood up. They struggled against domestic feudalism. The past was bad, the old Confucian past, and they fought against imperialism. And they managed to win and create the People's Republic of China. So this was a heroic story of victory, right? But after Tiananmen, Deng Xiaoping felt these young people don't even know where we've come from, how much the party has done for them. So we need patriotic education. And the patriotic education started this whole business of national humiliation, century of humiliation. And then you need an enemy. So Japan became an enemy, which had not been until then. You started celebrating Nanking Massacre, all these kinds of things. But you create a story of victimhood. And that's a very different mentality. So you can use history for whatever you want, frankly. This is a political decision and choice. I'm not saying that but what the objective historian would try and do is to learn from the past. When you say there have been other rising powers in the past, right? Some succeeded, some didn't. Then you look at the patterns. There are historians who have studied this. Many historians have studied this. Manjari Chatterjee Miller has a book coming out, I think maybe now, on this. And you study that experience and see, does it fit you? Does it fit your situation or the world today around you? It may not be exactly, you won't find exact analogies, but you need, for me, that's really the use of history. It trains you how to think issues through rather than, okay, here are your solutions. This is what works, this doesn't work. No, because don't forget, foreign policy is ultimately political, right? It's a process. It's not an engineering problem with a solution. And now solved, now let's move on, next problem. That's not how it works. Problems mutate in politics. They change their nature, they become benign, they become malign, whatever. It's a very different process and that's where history is useful in helping to think about it. But what about the public? It seems to me that where we fail is and frankly, I think there's a vested interest here in not just IR scholars, but in diplomats and so on, in saying, no, foreign policy, very complicated, it's something very rarefied, we'll do it among. This gives you power, right? This gives you a monopoly, this gives you control. I really think it's a vested interest. Ultimately, I think you should be justifying foreign policy to your people by saying, how does it help your welfare? Does it help your welfare or not? If it doesn't, it's not good foreign policy. Now, you might be saying defer some gains for, 2 years, 3 years, because in the long run, you'll get bigger gains, etc. All that, some pain today, but big gain tomorrow, whatever. But you must make that argument to your people in a democracy. And you must be showing people how that foreign policy works. So when I say India's foreign policy has overall been a success in the last 70 plus years, I use two measures. One, Indian people are actually better off today than before. And for the last 50 years at least, we've managed to stay out of war, and therefore created a peaceful environment. And certainly we've pulled a lot of people out of poverty in the period when we integrated with the rest of the world. The other measure is maybe not so immediate, but if you look at our relative standing by any metric of power against the rest of the world, we have improved our position vis-a-vis every country except China. China did even better than we did in the last 40 years. So by those two metrics, which I think most people understand, right? Because most people are proud of their country. They want to know, how's my country doing in the world? I think we haven't done badly over 70 years. We made mistakes. We made huge mistakes. We're learning as we go. But I think we haven't done badly overall, that we have managed to do. And those are the measures I would use with the people. And I think there should be more of that. There should be more of that questioning. But, the foreign policy establishment, the elite, they're quite happy to keep this as their own special. And it's the last thing that it's the last part of the sovereign actually in the democratic age, which they keep to themselves, diplomacy and war. These are the two things. Even in the US system, they're still fighting about the right.
We have Ambassador Menon, we have a question from Patrick. We'll take that and then we'll cluster some of the other questions. We have a lot lined up now.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I have actually two questions which are not connected at all to each other. The first is about Russia and its current foreign policy, not so much in relation to India or to Asia, but what Russia is seeking to do in relation to the European Union, whether it's, for example, events in Belarus or the kind of weaponizing of migrants, whether it's the poisonings in my hometown of Salisbury in England, various kind of things vis-a-vis Russia and the United States. I'm just sort of wondering, what is the logic of what they're doing? What are they hoping to achieve? Strategy or foreign policy? What's the kind of end game of it? And then the second question was about internal events in India and how they play out in terms of Indian foreign policy and the impact. So if you get sort of significant levels of social antagonism within the Indian system of the kind that you've seen on and off in the last sort of 5-6 years in particular, how much of a foreign policy impact does that have? Or do other countries simply say, well, that's your internal matter, you can run your country this way or that way, and that's up to you?
Well, on the first, on where's Russia going, I tend to see most of these as the weapons of the weak, poisoning, using little green men. These are things that you do when you can't work the system. When you can't work the system conventionally or using traditional means, then you turn to these sorts of methods. But it also seems to come out of this deep sense of frustration that I think the Russians have with their memory of this glorious past as a superpower, which I think every successful Russian leader has had to play into, say that we're making us great again, that we count again. And otherwise, it's hard to explain the levels of, you mentioned some of the things they're doing, weaponizing their economic levers and so on. But, and I don't think they like where they find themselves, increasingly dependent on China and pushed out of Europe, basically. Of course, they will tell you that the old agreements, implicit or explicit, about not bringing NATO to Russia's frontiers, not bringing the EU to Russia's frontiers, that all those have been broken. They have their list of complaints as well. But, you know, if you look at it in the long term, over the last, since Peter the Great, they want to be part of Europe. They want to be part of the club of advanced countries. And that's what they're being denied. And they will use every which way to show you how important they are. That's the way I see it. I mean, I think it's dangerous to underestimate Russia. And I really don't understand US policy towards Russia. But anyway, that's partly because I think I look at it as an Indian. Sitting in India, I see both Russia and Iran, who are traditionally and geopolitically at least natural partners for us on the continent, being pushed increasingly into the Chinese arms. And that's not a very good phenomenon from an Indian point of view. Certainly, we don't want to see the consolidation of the Eurasian landmass, as Mackinder would say, under new auspices, which is what seems to be happening, with Russia as a junior partner to the Chinese. Russians would take great offense when they hear that, by the way, by being called junior partner. And I don't think that's a natural position for them at all, but they're not being left much choice. And that is a problem. Is there a way out of this to change this? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't see it right now. I don't see agents of change either in the Russian internal situation or in the way the international situation is working out, either in Europe or in the US. So it looks like we're stuck with this for the time being. How do internal events in India impact our foreign policy? We see it all the time because, you know, especially in the subcontinent, because frankly, we might have all these modern so-called hard boundaries. We have these new Westphalian states. These are new states. They might be old nations, but they're very new states. Pakistan, Bangladesh, even newer. And they're all in their own internal processes of consolidation, but every border has cross-border ethnicities, has more smuggling, normally twice as much as the formal trade, which means that there's still life going on across these. There's all kinds of links across these borders, which the harder we try and make the borders, the more we criminalize all these activities, but also it means that the effect, the demonstration effect of what happens in India and the reactions to what happens in Indian internal politics will always be there. There is a direct transmission line. After all, you're talking about at least 30 to 40 million other subcontinental citizens in India at any time. That's not a small number. When you look at remittances, I mean, you know, there's something like $9 billion worth of remittances between India, from these countries to India, and from India to these countries. We keep saying this is the least integrated region of the world. That's because the state is blind to what's actually happening on Earth. When you look at our real borders, they're actually porous, most of them, whether with Nepal, whether with Bangladesh, so with Myanmar, certainly. So we need, I think, to understand that what we do, that this distinction between internal and external no longer exists. I'm not worried about reputational gain or loss and so on, because that, frankly, is to a very great extent motivated by the point of view of their interests. I mean, if they don't like what you're doing, they'll say you're not behaving as a responsible power. You have to step up to the plate. You need to do much more. Normally, all they mean is that please do what we want you to do. So I'm not getting into the reputational part of it, but I think in our case, the effects across the borders are immediate. The other thing, of course, is that if we get a reputation of a slowing economy and a divided and polarized society, the kinds of interactions we want to have with the rest of the world, those go down. I mean, all these economic needs that we have. That's unlikely. I mean, people don't invest in these places. If you stay out of these regional trading arrangements because of domestic pressures, then nobody's going to locate manufacturing here and then have to jump hurdles and hoops to create a global value chain. So I think in many ways, I think today we're in a world, in a globalized world, where that distinction between internal and external is gone. It's been broken by technology, it's been broken by economics. And increasingly, I think it's also a question of your own interests exceed your sovereign boundaries.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. So I'll get Sarthak's question in first, and then we'll cluster our other questions, one of which is already on our chat board. Sarthak, go ahead.
Right. Thank you, Sushmita. I have a question for myself, but also I think I have also received a few questions in the chat box, which I would like to ask. So my question is that we also read these days about populism and how populist thought is also affecting foreign policies, especially with a very personalized and personalistic kind of an appeal, right? Which is surpassing these institutional ideas, or how you said that diplomacy is also kind of substituted with personalistic appeals. I was just wondering that how do you evaluate the kind of for India's relations vis-a-vis Turkey, and we have seen that both India and Turkey are also seemingly in a very populist kind of a path, where both have different kind of trajectories. One is imagining itself as what I can call as a civilizational state, whereas Turkey is trying to put itself as a empire state, like as a kind of an empire nation, trying to go back to its previous idea of using again the point that you said about history, trying to get back reclaim its glory of the Ottoman past, and trying to emerge as a very strong Muslim nation, Muslim power. And I was just wondering that with respect to the theater in Central Asian countries, which are also sensitive for their key energy sources that they have, how do you see India and Turkey's relationship and their foreign exchange and foreign relations developing over the next over the coming future?
If I can also add on to that, Ambassador, because we have a lot of questions, and this is something which came to us in chat, which might be related to this question of the narrative. And you said that any country to succeed has to build a successful narrative. And we had a question on what you think, in which direction the narrative of India is going, especially considering that narratives do take a long time to solidify. So is there still what do you see the path is? So I'll just tag that onto the specific question of which Sarthak asked. And this was a question from Sathvik, this question of narratives.
On populism, it not just diminishes your capacity to respond, with give and take, negotiate, bargain, diplomacy, but it also has other effects. If you're driven by, well, you see it in daily life. If you're driven by personality cults and ego, other people will use it. It's a weakness, right? So they will give you status and face and get their work done, but not necessarily do what you want them to do. This is a manipulative business at one level. I mean, you are trying to shape the world environment to work for you, right? But if you're more busy satisfying your ego or your status goals or other things, then what happens to the transformation of India? That gets left behind. So there is a problem with populism because it's not dealing with, your clarity of goal, your clarity of vision gets clouded. And you then start making choices for other reasons. I want historical revenge. I want status. I mean, my favorite example is, why do you want a seat on the UN Security Council? I mean, this is a beauty contest. It's not other people have to vote for you. I don't see how it helps. Is it going to feed people? Is it going to help your people's welfare? I mean, if you can show me some link, then I would say, yes, it's worth it. But I don't see this as a, big goal that we should be seeking. But it's a populist goal.
Yeah, exactly.
And it will be. And that's my point, that, you know, it leads you into choices which don't really work. Turkey, I think, is very important, but I think, you know, Turkey herself today, I think, is still working out where she wants to be, because between, you know, Central Asia is a very crowded space. Not just the stans themselves, and Kazakhstan is no small country. It's a big country. So is Uzbekistan, actually, if you look at it. But China, the Russia, Iran, Turkey, all think this is their backyard, that their security is tied up with what happens there. Each of them have proxies. You look at, you know, doesn't matter whether it's some small war about Nagorno-Karabakh, suddenly everybody is involved. Russia, everybody. Yes, with the US withdrawal, she's not there today, but if she's going to be a global superpower, she'll be back. So I'm not sure. I have always argued that maybe, you know, we don't like what Turkey does with Pakistan and so on, but there are times when you need to hold your nose and work with somebody, you know, for bigger goals, which in our case, I think includes, this is our way, unless we work with Iran and Turkey, thanks to the fact that Pakistan has cut us off, we cannot pursue our interests in Central Asia. And we have interests, and not just counterterrorism and so on, but we do have other interests also. And we have defensive interests. But so for me, I mean, you've seen Afghanistan. We certainly have an interest in what happens in Afghanistan, and we can't access it directly. You've seen they won't even let us send wheat now, you know, so for me, Turkey matters, but Turkey has to be part of a bigger strategy, which includes the others, the other factors in Central Asia. About the narrative, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but, you know, old Venkatesan, who used to be Foreign Secretary years ago, I mean, in the 80s, he used to say that it's a law of physics or optics that the image can never be better than the reality. And that ultimately reality will catch up with you. So yes, you can construct a narrative, but why do you need the narrative? You need the narrative to make sense of reality, not to burnish reality, to falsify it or to project something else. You need a narrative which tells you where you're going and why you're going there and how you're going to get there and how you are certain to succeed. I mean, that's what the American dream, China dream, all these narratives that they construct, that's what they really are. I mean, that's their utility, not to convince other people that I'm wonderful and that I'm the greatest. And, you know, that's not, frankly. So I think you need to put narrative in context. And the important thing for us, and we've been lucky actually, that the rise of India has actually been masked by the rise of China. I mean, I have Chinese friends, very senior now, who used to ask me every 5 years, why does the world object to China's rise and not object to India's rise? And of course, the honest answer would be because we don't threaten them the way you do. But that's not, but you can't say that, right? But the fact is that that because of their rise, India's rise has been masked. But there will be a day, and if we go on rising, there will be a day when the established powers will see you as a threat, because nobody wants peer competitors. Why is the US doing this to China today? To prevent the emergence of a peer competitor. Previously, it was the Soviet Union. For a short while, it was Japan. In the 80s, Plaza Accord took care of that. Now it's China. And if you keep rising and growing the way you are, and if you handle your own affairs well, that time will come for you too. But put it off as far as possible. And that's the utility of a narrative. That's why China was busy talking about peaceful rise of China in Hu Jintao's time. But it cannot be divorced from reality. It has to reflect some reality. And that we have to remember. Today, you know, this is the trouble with the postmodern age. Everybody thinks it can be completely divorced from anything on the ground. That I don't believe.
Thank you. So let's cluster some questions, and then we will we can you can decide on what you'll answer in the remaining time. So we do have some students waiting for some time. So Manan and Srinivas, let's ask your questions, and then we have a question from Amol, which Sarthak will ask on his behalf. So let's take the 3 questions and then let's go to the answer.
Okay. So good evening, sir. It has been a pleasure to hear you discuss about this topic. And I am actually a first-year student, and I'm not very sure about my questions because I don't have a lot of knowledge about this topic, like the question that I'm going to ask. But I'm very curious to know your opinion, because there are a lot of different opinions that are on the internet. So the first question is, what are your thoughts about the partition, like the India-Pakistan partition? Because it hasn't proved to be very beneficial for us. And the second is, like, would you think that it has affected the countries all across the world and the geopolitics in any way?
Okay, so Sarthak, will you read out Srinivas's question, because that's also on chat, and then you can also post the other question you have on chat. Thank you, Manan, for your question.
Right. Thank you so much. I'll just read Srinivas's question. Is that Nehru had a grand strategy that comprised of non-alignment in foreign policy, secularism as an imperative for a united and internally peaceful India, and industrialization as a response to both our need to transform India and to the external situation of the Cold War. Do we have such an integrated grand strategy today? And secondly, he's asking, in the US-Soviet Cold War, India was on the periphery mostly, but the US-China competition is at our doorstep. So how should our strategic autonomy now be different from what we had during the Cold War? So this is Srinivas's question. I'll ask Amol's question after you answer this.
Okay, about partition, that's really a good question. Manan, the partition of India was actually part of a whole series of partitions. And wherever you look, the effects were not good. Whether it was a partition of Korea, which is still there, Vietnam partition, but they managed through years and years of war to overcome it. Palestine partition, 2-state solution, you've seen where it's ended up. It's a complete mess. I mean, force might hold it together, but it's not a good solution. Cyprus partitioned, not good. I have a colleague in Ashoka, Pallavi Raghavan, who's actually working on partitions on larger. I mean, she did her PhD on India, Pakistan, and how they work together just after independence in strengthening each other's sovereignty, because they had an interest in strengthening their own. But it is, I think it was, the people who did the partitions saw it as a useful device to continue to maintain their rule. It was part of divide and rule in its crudest form. But, and it served imperial interests of powers who maybe didn't want the headache of having to run the colonies anymore, but wanted the geopolitical advantages. And especially once the Cold War came, it became entangled in the Cold War bipolarity. I don't think you'll find very many people who will tell you that partitions worked or that they helped. But partitions, in a sense, also are a result of this Westphalian state, this idea that you must have hard boundaries, defined territory, that sovereignty stops at this line. And this actually goes against all the facts of nature. I mean, it's, look at all our borders. I mean, everything crosses those borders. People, ideas, the goods, water, I mean, climate. What respects these? Terrorism, nothing respects these borders. But this Westphalian idea that somehow there is an absolute line that you can draw and therefore you can partition countries and you can, I think it's a source of endless trouble. The interesting part is that all these artificial borders that in Africa have actually stayed. And you wonder why. But I suppose the risk of undoing them is just so great that life goes on around them rather than, than with them. But it's a huge question what you've raised about partition, about boundaries, about borders, about how this works, and the effect it's had on communities. In our case, it's had very bad effects on the border communities, on traditional communities which used to move across these boundaries, these borders, and the life that used to go on. And you see that in our case, actually, not just with Pakistan. You look at our traditional links with Xinjiang, with Tibet, all gone in the last 70 years. So it's actually quite a sad story. About Nehru's grand strategy, and do we have a similar grand strategy now? I think, there are approximations, but I've been saying for some time that I think it's time the government came out with a sense of, with a clear vision of what kind of grand strategy they envisage. Because it means clarity on the nature of the world that we face. It means clarity on what kind of India we want to build. And the strategy has to be the bridge between the two. And I don't see that. I haven't seen it for some time. I've been saying over and over again, we need it, but and frankly, this paper that I mentioned is an attempt to try and prod people in that direction. US-Soviet Cold War, yes, we were peripheral, we were lucky to be peripheral, and we were therefore left largely to our own devices during the Cold War. Today, the major fault line is right next to us, as you said, China-US rivalry. I mean, China and the US wants Nepal as part of free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. China, of course, wants Nepal now part of BRI and tied into her system. But what it means for us is that we need to play a much more active role. I mean, this is why we see such an active Chinese presence in our neighborhood. If you look at BRI commitments by China in the subcontinent, it's over $100 billion. This is new. This is very recent. It's in the last 5 years. Suddenly it's become important, the subcontinent. The US interest in the subcontinent is much more than ever before. So if we want to work with our neighbors, we need to step up our game, both economically, becoming a source of prosperity for our neighbors, but also as a source of security for them. And we should be seen as a factor of stability for them, which enables them to actually stay out of other people's fights, rather than just becoming a playground for Sino-US rivalry or for other things like that. And I think that's where we need to step up our game. It just means that we have to do much more. Luckily, we have means today that we never had during the Cold War. We have a level of agency, we have a level of capacity, which we never had before. And we should never underestimate that. But we need to learn to use it, and we need to be willing to go out and use it. That's why I say we have to be engaged. That's why, in fact, my last book is basically a plea for engagement abroad.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon, and I think that's a good place for us to end. We have unfortunately run out of time. We did have a few more questions, but in the interest of time, I'll turn it over to Sarthak for a vote of thanks for us. And we did have a chat. If people want to put their question on chat, and while Sarthak is giving his vote of thanks, if anything.
Right. Thank you so much, Suchishmita. And Ambassador Menon, I mean, like I said in the beginning also, we really were looking forward to this talk so that such important issues and such important questions could be brought up for discussion and to foster this idea. Like you said, I think as foreign policy is not a engineering problem which can be solved, right? It is a process which has to continue and the exploration has to go on. And I think today's talk puts it rightly in that position where these kind of questions or these kind of very different and very diverse questions can actually be brought forth and can be discussed upon, and we really have very interesting questions which for the lack of time, like the influence of big tech or something else in foreign policies also. So I'm sure that we'll have more occasions for having a very greater engagement on these kind of very interesting and newer emerging aspects of developments in the realm of foreign policy in future. Thank you so much for giving this time and giving this very insightful lecture. And we thank all our participants for a very, very good and very enthusiastic engagement today. Thank you so much. That's it from us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. And I wanted to thank all those who asked questions. Some very good questions there.
Yes.